All right, it seems like the numbers are evening out a little bit, so hopefully folks have been able to join us. Thanks for being here today. Just a technical note from the top, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A or the chat at any point. We will probably hold them until the end, but it does not mean that you can't get your question in early, so that we don't have to ask for them at the end. So you don't forget. So if you think of anything, just drop it right in the chat or the Q&A. With that, thanks everybody for being here. I'm Michaela Campbell. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Congressional Fire Services Institute, and I'll be the moderator of today's panel, so I will be keeping an eye out for all of your questions. Our discussion today is on fire sprinkler systems. As I'm sure you all have seen, it has been not a great start to the year. It was really terrible to see the news about the devastating fires in Philadelphia and the Bronx. In the weeks since, there's been a lot of conversations on what's been going on there, and it's become clear generally that there's more that we can do to help prevent these kinds of tragedies. So these fires are, for example, a reminder that many buildings around the country are still not equipped with fire sprinkler systems, especially in residential buildings. And these systems are what we'd like to talk about today, so we can understand more about what they are, how they work, and how they can help keep people safe in their own homes. So I'm very fortunate to be joined today by a fantastic panel of experts. We have Vickie Pritchett with the National Fire Sprinkler Association, Chief Michael O'Brien, Fire Chief of the Brighton Area Fire Authority, and he's here representing the International Association of Fire Chiefs, Lorraine Carli with the National Fire Protection Association, Karl Fippinger with the International Code Council, and Evan Davis with the International Association of Firefighters. So thanks to all the panelists for being here, and let's jump right in. So when asked what keeps them up at night, many chiefs have said high-rise fires are on the list. So Chief O'Brien, let's start with you. Can you, for those who might not know what those are, can you give a very quick explanation? What is a high-rise fire? And can you help us understand the challenges that they pose to emergency response?
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. You know, when we look across the country in the United States, you know, high-rise typically is something more than 4 or 5 stories in height. And when we start to talk about high-rise, right, this potential for a fire is now elevated. And so modern construction or buildings that were built today pose a much different fire risk than maybe a high-rise built in the 60s and 70s, just due to the protection strategies. So, you know, really from a fire service standpoint, they're very staff dependent. And we need a lot of firefighters to get vertical and up to that fire floor. You know, a lot of times I tell people, think about taking the stairs in your hotel, right? So let's say you're staying on the 10th floor and you're going to take the stairs, but I want you to carry your luggage. When you think about how you feel when you get to that 10th floor, that's what our firefighters are experiencing. And then that's really where their work begins, is once they get to that firefighting floor. You know, as a fire chief and as many of our fire departments know, fighting fires is inherently dangerous. There's a lot to it, not only from the products of combustion, smoke and the heat, right? But our staff will do incredible things to save other people's lives. And we've seen that work, and we've seen that work ethic in single and 2-story homes. And it's just, it's very difficult even in that environment. And when we elevate it into higher levels, it takes a lot more staff, it takes a lot more equipment. And truly, the staff is put in some very difficult situations. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, especially the fires in our older buildings, right? This is where our inspection staff and some of our other staff really stay busy in working with those property owners to keep the protective measures in place. Because if our fire doors aren't working, our smoke doors aren't working, our stairwells aren't accessible, it truly compounds our staff's ability to get to work. You know, it's higher than most of our ladder trucks. It's very limited access, and it's the only access they have is purely and typically through those stairs. So, you know, when people hear about these high-rise fires, you know, it's very rare they stay in a nice contained little box. And so fire chiefs all across the country are trying to work on ways with their elected officials, their municipal government, to not only make sure they're prepared, but that their staff really has all the tools they need.
Thanks, Chief. Really appreciate it. And Evan, could I ask you to follow up on that as well with your perspective?
Sure. Chief O'Brien did a fantastic job of summarizing the challenges that our firefighters face when they do encounter these fires. You know, carrying the weight of all that gear and the physical exertion of just getting to the fire floor before even beginning any fire suppression operations just puts such a tremendous toll on the firefighters themselves that we really see a lot of injuries and unfortunately deaths occurring from firefighters who are responding to these high-rise fires. Here in the District of Columbia, just a few years ago, sadly, we lost a firefighter following a high-rise fire near Logan Circle. And his death, unfortunately, really illustrates the danger that firefighters face every day with these high-rise fires. And anything we can do to help prevent these fires from occurring in the first place not only helps prevent the deaths of folks who are living and working in those high-rise buildings, but also helps make sure we have a safer work environment for the firefighters who we do have to send into those high-rise incidents and do their best to contain those fires.
Thanks, Evan. So Vickie, turning to you a little bit, can you tell us what are fire sprinklers and how do they work?
Sure, Michaela, that sounds like an easy question, and thankfully it is a very simple answer. Fire sprinklers are life-saving devices. They are technology that exists to keep water ready, to be on the standby ready all the time. And I like to say that fire sprinklers are life-saving devices. They're property protection. They also are pet protectors. We think about in today's homes, we have so many homes that have pets as family members. Well, the fire sprinklers are there to protect the pets if you're at work, and they really do add that added protection. I like to say that they're also historical preservers. It's not preserved until it's protected. Many downtown historic districts have embraced that, and you're seeing more and more of that across the country, and it really does make a difference, especially for firefighters. And Paul Coombs did a cartoon a few years ago that said that fire sprinklers, and he actually had the sprinkler in the cartoon. He said fire sprinklers are a firefighter's best friend. I really like that cartoon, and I always enjoy all of the illustrations that Paul does for us. But I have to circle back and say the technical answer to that question is that fire sprinklers are heat activated. You are not going to set off a fire sprinkler by burning the toast. It takes heat, and it needs to be to 155 degrees for this little bulb that's inside the sprinkler to burst and allow the water to flow. And then typically one fire sprinkler controls the fire and keeps the fire in the room of origin. And that is giving you time to get out. It's protecting the firefighters who are going to still be coming to help. And we like to say as well that fire sprinklers and firefighters make an unbeatable team, partners in progress, truly.
Thanks, Vickie. So that's really helpful. But I know in conversations that I've had with friends and family and even some other folks in the fire service, there are a lot of different narratives or stories that I've heard about fire sprinklers. So can you clear some of that up? And can you talk a little bit about some of the common misconceptions about fire sprinklers?
Well, I sure can, Michaela. And I think one of the first ones that comes to mind is some people say they're ugly. I myself think they're beautiful, but I realize that for some folks, they think that they don't want to see this. Well, that's why they have these beautiful little creations, and you can't even see that the sprinkler is there. And those are available even in different colors. So that first myth that we like to talk about is what they will look like. I have fire sprinklers in my home, and I always want people to ask me about them first and foremost, and they never do. I wind up having to say, hey, don't you want to ask me about my fire sprinklers, and pointing to them to point them out. The other thing that we deal with on a regular basis is Hollywood movies. And in Hollywood, they like to have, when there's a fire, that they all go off. And that is simply not the truth. That's not how fire sprinklers work. Only the fire sprinkler closest to the fire activates, and typically most fires are controlled by one fire sprinkler. So those are common myths that we deal with. And I can assure you that all of the organizations that are represented here on our call today, we spend millions of dollars investing in education materials, both for smoke alarms, escape planning, and also fire sprinklers. But yet with one Hollywood movie, they can undo years of our investment in our fire prevention messaging. So I think it's an important question to ask. And the good news is it's very simple technology. Those myths are easy to bust mythbusters, if you will. And it's important for us to reiterate that. The last thing that I would say that typically falls in that same category is how much they cost. NFPA has conducted research, and those reports are available. Fire sprinklers are very affordable, and they're not as expensive as many people will lead you to believe. So I encourage you to do your investigation into that. New home construction for installing fire sprinklers is typically 1 to 1.5% of the cost of the home. Many questions are asked about high-rise and retrofit pricing. We have been able to look across the country and see very affordable pricing for retrofitting of high-rise buildings. And that's important, especially in light of recent fires that we've watched happen in the early month of 2022.
Thanks, Vickie. Really appreciate it. And I have definitely heard some of those stories in conversation. So to kind of move on from there, and Vickie, I want to address what you were talking about the fire sprinklers being a firefighter's best friend. So Chief OBrien, can I turn that over to you? Can you explain a little bit, now that we've got some context on high-rise fires, but also, a little bit more on structural fire generally. Can you talk about how sprinklers actually help in fire response?
As fire chief, one of my major roles is looking to reduce the impact of fire on our communities. And so when we have a fire event in a home, to a commercial occupancy, to a multi-story, there is no doubt that there is an impact on our community, right? In worst case, life loss, even a small, what we would deem a minor fire that our firefighters have to put a line in service to extinguish that fire. It's a bad day for those occupants. It's hard to see your life get consumed, your items in your home get consumed. And truly, when I start to look at fire sprinklers within our community, it creates this non-event in many cases for us, because what may have tied us up for 4, 8 hours, or maybe it's even just an hour on a room and contents fire, really becomes down to a 1-2 vehicle apparatus style thing that we're responding to. And it really is aiding us in help keep our units in service. A lot of fire departments here in Michigan are reporting out their 2021 statistics, and they're all reporting over 25% increases in their total call volume compared to the year prior. Now, we know COVID had some fluctuations there, but we're always striving to keep our apparatus in service so they can get to the real emergencies as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. And, as we start to have fires in sprinkled buildings, we had one this year in a 2-story apartment building. One engine was able to handle it, no injuries to the occupant. And it really became this non-exciting event where the system worked, right? The building codes, the education, the occupant. From time to time, mistakes happen when we live and work inside buildings. And boy, did the sprinkler work. That one sprinkler went off, it extinguished the fire, it allowed the occupant to get out, and it really limited our full response down to 1 unit and a chief officer to really aid that community. But I probably want to toss this over to Evan to talk about, but really as fire chiefs, we're ultimately concerned about our safety of our staff, right? How do I keep them out of these carcinogens that are happening in fires? How do I keep the heart attacks low? And right, by reducing those incidents, I can only imagine, hopefully, that it helps us change that safety. So maybe I'll toss it over to Evan, maybe just to talk about how the safety is for the firefighters.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. And that's a wonderful point. Every day we're learning more and more about the health effects that we see in firefighters from responding to fires. 3-4 decades ago, when you saw something wood burn, something wool burn, whether it's carpet, whether it's a table, that's one type of gas and smoke that that burning material sets off. Now, unfortunately, the what I bought is a wood table that I'm sitting at right now is probably not wood. It's probably some nice sawdust glued together. Same with the carpeting in my house. It's probably not real wool. It's probably synthetic materials. Unfortunately, most things are synthetic materials. And when those burn, it releases a tremendous amount of toxic, noxious gases into the air. Our firefighters certainly have their self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBAs, that they wear, but those chemicals and those carcinogens really go everywhere. They go onto the jackets we wear, onto the helmets we wear. They make their way onto the skin of our firefighters. And ultimately, what we're learning more and more about is the tremendous rates of cancer occurrence we see in the fire service today. All those exposures to smoke and fires leading to downstream incidences of cancer among our firefighters. And that's really one of the biggest health risks that we're seeing our firefighters facing today after the immediate fire in and of itself has been extinguished. Now, sprinklers can do a tremendous amount of good to protect the health of firefighters and prevent those cancer cases from occurring by simply preventing the fires from really happening in the first place. And it's those large mega fires that if we're able to keep them in check, like Chief O'Brien said, take those, what we call full box alarms of multi-truck, multi-engine responses, really contain them down into just something that a single engine and, you know, a 4 firefighter crew could handle, really reduces that exposure to the firefighters tremendously. One of the other real benefits that we see from fire sprinklers as well is affording more time for both our firefighters to work as well as occupants for the buildings to escape. Energy efficiency is a wonderful thing. One of the big challenges we see, though, is it really kind of helps to retain heat and those gases inside the home. And we're seeing fires reach what we call critical flashover point a whole lot more faster these days. Flashover is the point at which everything ignitable, including the smoke itself, ignites. Unfortunately, it's tremendously dangerous to both occupants of the fire as well as the firefighters themselves who are operating. Having that sprinkler system in place will keep that room cooler, will keep the fire in check, and prevent that flashover from occurring, really buying time for occupants to escape and for our fire crews to operate more safely and effectively.
Now that we understand a little bit more about fire sprinklers, how they work, how they can help, I'd love to talk a little bit more about why don't we all have them? So Lorraine, can I pitch this over to you? I'd love to hear a little bit more about what do the national codes and standards say about fire sprinklers and who is required to have them?
Sure. Thanks, Michaela, and thanks for having me. Sprinkler provisions have been in the codes and standards going back decades, and we've known their value for over a century. In fact, the latest versions of the codes and standards require that all new buildings that include residential use be built with fire sprinklers. When it comes to existing buildings, there have been many requirements in the codes and standards put in place in various jurisdictions to mandate the installation of sprinklers in older buildings, like what we saw over the last couple of weeks. In fact, the latest edition of NFPA 101, which is the life safety code, requires that all high-rise apartment buildings be retrofitted with sprinklers by 2033. But in order for retrofitting requirements to be enforced, or the requirement to build new homes with sprinklers for that matter, jurisdictions have to choose to use the code and not amend out the sprinkler provisions. We know all high-rise buildings and any types of homes should have sprinklers to maximize that occupant safety from fire and, as we've just heard, to protect our first responders. However, what we see is pushback about retrofitting because of the expense and the intrusive process for people who live in those spaces. It's not easy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at ways to increase safety in older housing. We've seen lots of success stories when time is allowed for budgeting and planning to take place, but we have to start with that commitment to safety. I just want to use a couple of examples here. Great example in Massachusetts, they passed a retrofit requirement for buildings that were built before 1975, and owners had 12 years to get it done. And they did it. They retrofitted those buildings. On the flip side, we saw the Marco Polo high-rise condominium in Honolulu. They had a fire in 2013 that caused about $1 million in damages. They thought that the estimate they got to retrofit that of about $4.5 million was too expensive, so they didn't do it. And then in 2017, 4 people died, and there was more than $100 million in damages in another fire in the same building. This fire was the driver behind Honolulu's retrofit ordinance. In addition to the damages, there were untold legal costs. Marco Polo then installed sprinkler system for about $5 million. So two very different stories with very different outcomes. So it can be done. We've seen it in nursing home retrofits where we're seeing the numbers of deaths and those types of occupancies go down because exactly what we've been talking about, that life-saving benefit of sprinklers.
Thanks, Lorraine. And Karl, could I ask you to chime in on that as well, please?
Sure. Lorraine did a really great job there too. And I think in the end, what I wanted to do is maybe piggyback onto what she mentioned a little bit too about, that health and safety and the commitment that we've got not only to building occupants, but also to our partners in on the fire and emergency services. The codes and standards really complement their health and safety too, right? So, it's for occupants and for responders alike. So, the good news story here is that the codes already have, as Lorraine said, this pathway to success for governments and building owners to be able to kind of handle the problem that we're seeing. The real problem, as I see it, I think many others see it, is that we're trying to solve the problem for this existing building stock that's out there that were not necessarily built at a time that would help them to benefit from where we are or even conform with today's modern day codes and standards. So, as Lorraine said, I mean, we have similar codes that address everything from residential buildings, commercial buildings. We have a standalone fire code that's akin to the NFPA 101 as well. And we also have a specific code for existing buildings. Every single one of those codes has sprinkler provisions in it. The difficulty is that we, being Lorraine and I and others that are in the building codes and standards industry, well, we're the stewards of that process, right? We bring together some of the smartest minds across government that includes the fire service, but also building owners, building industry professionals and others, code officials from across the country and even across the world to sit down and on a 3-year cycle, update those codes with what we've learned and where the latest thinking and technology is headed. Sprinklers have been in and they continue to be in, and we continue to add them in places. The difficulty is that, as I said, we're the stewards. In the end, it's on the federal, state, local, territorial, tribal government organizations that adopt these codes to make sure that they adopt the full model and don't amend out sprinkler provisions. Because, as I said, the information's there, the pathway to success is there. It's really a matter of budget and political will to be able to make sure that we make a stand on fire sprinklers to be able to negate and prevent situations like we saw in the Bronx and situations like we saw in Philadelphia from happening again. So the answers are there, but it's on us to do something about it.
Thanks, Karl, and thanks, Lorraine. And I'd love to just follow up on that point that you both made about piecemeal adoption, if you will, of the codes and the amending out of the fire sprinkler portion. So is that a frequent issue? How frequently is this happening? What's the coverage look like across the country if you have that kind of information or perspective to share? And what the bottom line though is, what more can be done to encourage adoption and implementation? And Lorraine, I'll start with you and then go to Karl, but would really appreciate hearing your take on that.
Sure. As we've said, NFPA 101 and the other codes that we've been talking about is used extensively in the US. However, what we do see is states and jurisdictions not necessarily using it in their entirety or making amendments. What we want to stress is that an unamended code really establishes the minimum level of safety. So when you ask, Michaela, what more can be done, there is a lot we can do. One of the biggest challenges I think we have today is complacency. Because the number of fires has gone down over the decades, it's led to a little bit of public and policymaker base who thinks that fire still isn't a risk and it can't happen in their communities until it does. These tragic events that have brought us here today are really coming on the heels of one another, that latest wake-up call. So whether it's in urban areas or rural or those in the path of wildfire risk, fire is taking lives and properties at a time when we should be employing the policies and practices we know work. using and enforcing the latest codes and standards, ensuring that first responders have the resources they need, and making sure the public knows what to do before and during these incidents to better protect themselves and their families. It's really that fire and life safety ecosystem approach that we've all talked about. All the pieces need to be working together to reduce loss. You know, without the will and the resources to bring hundreds of thousands of substandard homes up to code and build the new ones without skirting the safety provisions like the sprinkler one, we're really placing the large share of the burden on our first responders. And, you know, we've talked about that here today, how critical that is to better protect our first responders. As we saw in both of these fires, the response was really quick, within minutes. Yet the death toll was quick and substantial. There's no doubt the numbers would have been higher without the efforts of both departments, but we shouldn't have to have them shouldering the brunt when we have the means to solve the fire problem. So back to your question about what more can be done, some very specific things. Earmarking funds for safety infrastructure, using and enforcing those current editions of the codes, inspecting and testing systems to address issues before things turn for the worst, prioritizing community risk assessments so we can figure out where the problems are, making those right decisions in the interest of safety. And as we've talking about today, advocating for the increased use of sprinklers in all buildings and homes.
Thanks, Lorraine. And Karl, could I ask you to follow up as well? You know, what more from your perspective can be done to help encourage adoption and implementation, and making sure that we are using the, I guess, for lack of a better word, complete model of the code, and also helping to move forward to ensure life safety, both for residents of these buildings, but also for first responders?
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce, it's a really good question, Michaela. I wanted to reinforce what Lorraine said too, is that, you know, the model codes are really viewed as the minimum code set. And if amended, when amended, they weaken the minimum set rather than strengthen them. So I think there's potentially a false sense of security out there amongst folks that use the most recent codes. But when you adopt a code that does not have those fire sprinkler provisions in them, they're automatically, the codes assume that fire sprinklers are in. Whether it be the residential code, the building code, the fire code. We even have provisions in the existing building code, as I said, for when you make alterations or amendments to existing buildings, at what point they now require, coming up to date with the most recent codes and standards that include automatic fire sprinklers. So, in the end, as you amend those out, the code already assumes that they're in. So there are a series of trade-offs that are not quite the same protection as you're afforded by an automatic fire sprinkler system. So in the end, if the choice is made to amend those out, you've got to replace them with more stringent requirements, including more fire safe rated walls to go for an extended period of time if they're exposed to fire, including more stairwells, whether they be interior stairwells or exterior fire escapes. Other means of egress is the best way to say that, to be able to trade off for the fact that you're not given that head start or that complete protection by a full automatic sprinkler system to be able to get out alive. In the case of the Bronx, we saw one unit in a 19-story apartment building with an uncontrolled door where the occupants made it out, but yet we saw almost every other floor in that building affected by smoke. And none of those folks felt the effects of the fire, but only the smoke and the toxic gases. So, in the end, I've been to fires like that. I've spent 30 years in the fire service. I can tell you that I've been to multiple saves from sprinklers, even where occupants did not do the best that they could do to save themselves by doing hazardous things in their units. But the surrounding units were saved because the sprinklers, as Vickie said, controlled that fire. So in the end, what can you do? Well, adopt the latest codes and standards. Don't amend out your sprinkler requirements. We also say not only adopt, but you have to implement them effectively and stand up the programs that surround them. You have to inspect, as Chief OBrien said, on a very regular and recurring basis. And most importantly, you have to enforce for the folks that are not able to take the hint or the direction or the guidance that they're being given by public officials when they come for those inspections. And that's what completes the loop. So it's adopt, implement, inspect, and by all means, enforce, enforce, enforce.
So thanks, Karl, and thanks, Lorraine. And not to belabor this point, but it sounds, clearly there's a lot of interplay here between the federal, state, and local levels. And one thing that you both have mentioned is adopting the most up-to-date codes and standards. So while I know we definitely have some folks on this call who are very familiar with that environment, could you just very quickly explain, how frequently are codes and standards updated? And does that automatically mean that your jurisdiction would have the most up-to-date code? And because I think sometimes I've come across situations where there's some confusion about how that adoption process works. And I do think it's really important that people understand that they may not be up to date. So Lorraine, can I throw that over to you for a minute?
Sure, absolutely. As Karl said before, the codes and standards are updated on a 3-year cycle, but that doesn't mean they're automatically used in jurisdictions. So then each jurisdiction goes through their own process to update or potentially amend the codes and standards. So actually, you can go to the NFPA website, nfpa.org, and we have something called Code Finder, and you'll find a list of all. You can click on a state and find what versions of the codes. So unfortunately, we do see some states that are 2-3 cycles behind on the codes, which means they're missing out on the latest thinking, the latest technology, the latest research that is part of that consensus process to update the codes. I think the other thing that's interesting, Michaela, is we did some research a couple of years ago when we asked the public if they thought they were living in jurisdictions with the most up-to-date codes, and overwhelmingly they said yes, they do expect that their policymakers are using the latest versions of codes without amending out safety provisions. So, and as we know, that's not always the reality across the country. So it is important for the public also to know what codes are being used in their jurisdiction and advocate for that level of safety that they think they're getting.
And when you say 2 to 3 code cycles, we're talking like 6 to 10 years approximately.
So when you say that, yeah, exactly. If we talk about them being updated, we have some that have not been updated since 2012 or 2016. And so you want to make sure that your jurisdiction is not one of those that has lagged behind in using the latest versions of the codes.
And Karl, I know you mentioned a little bit about ICC's process, but similar kind of thing on your end as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much a similar thing, open, transparent process, consensus-based, some really smart folks at the table developing the model codes. But, I guess I would put an exclamation point on what Lorraine said, which is if you're talking a code cycle that's 3 years, and let's just say that your community's codes are 9 years out of date. Let me clarify that a little bit to say you're not just 9 years out of date. That code cycle began 3 years previously. So you're almost at the point where you're talking about 12 years worth of, you don't have the opportunity to benefit from the latest thinking and the latest technology and the latest solutions for the past 12 years, you're 9 years out and so forth. So that's a really big deal. And like the NFPA, the ICC has a website. And if you go to our website, you can also see, just like you can on the NFPA's, where codes are adopted, and unfortunately, maybe where there are either gaps or they lag behind. I'd also say that we've spent a lot of time working in the all hazards world with both the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, or FLASH. And there's a website out there where you can go and just type right in your address, and across all hazards, be able to see at the single family, multifamily, or commercial building level what the codes are where you live. So inspecttoprotect.org, all one word, inspecttoprotect.org, or you can go to the ICC's website and take a look at that as well, and just enter in your state, your address, and the no code, no confidence site that Inspector Protect has. So, we encourage you to go out there and get an idea and awareness of this, because, as Lorraine said, there is a great perception out there that you may be protected when in all reality, you're not, and you need to be able to get back onto the most current codes and get on cycle.
Thanks, Karl. So I really appreciate Lorraine and Karl, the background on that, because I do think it's very important to talk about the codes and standards that are underpinning all of this. But, you know, and another point that you guys made that I just want to reiterate is, you know, Karl, you mentioned that in the, I believe it was the New York fire, it's a 19-story building. There was a fire on one floor with a issue with the door. There were victims on almost every floor.
What I'd do is maybe throw it over to Chief O'Brien. I can see he's getting a little restless, and I know him well. But I would point to him for a moment for the operational aspects on that, and he's also a code expert in his own right. So I'd say maybe for Chief O'Brien to take a swing at that, maybe what some of the differences would be in that building if it were built today, even if the door were left open while there was an active fire in there, if there were sprinklers and if there were modern day, you know, pieces of technology and mechanisms in place for fire prevention in that building, you know, how much the outcome would have been different. So I throw it back over to Chief O'Brien and maybe to Evan for some follow up on that too.
Yeah, there's no doubt that I think just as that incident plays out, we're going to learn more in comparing it, right? But when you look at modern high-rise to legacy high-rise buildings, you know, we've talked about sprinkler protection, but you know, one of the big things is early notification, right? So we're going to get the detection aspect in common places. We're going to get pressurized stairwells. You know, all of those things that start to aid, and we've improved. Even look at the size of the stairwell, right? You really look at the changes that have happened since 2001 in the geometry, the widths of our stairwells that allow firefighters to get up to the fire floors to do their job, as well as allowing occupants to get down. I mean, it is night and day. You know, if you really have an opportunity to go look at this new style high-rise building compared to something that was built, you know, even more than 20 or 30 years ago, it's incredible the resources that are built into that building in construction type, in systems that are in there to help protect or for use by firefighters. It's really unbelievable, really, the difference. And you know, we look at sprinklers as that stopgap because, you know, you go back, if one or two sprinklers controlled that initial fire, that smoke doesn't mitigate because we're not producing that smoke. And I think that's what we're all, you know, it's a very simple solution, but yet very complex in many ways. And I think, you know, we're seeing that in a lot of the comments right now. I think we have people on old codes and we see it across the country. And I think just to echo, right, updating these codes and standards are a big thing. You know, one of the comments in the questions is relating to you know, people who are against sprinkler mandates. And there's no doubt we get really good code changes when we keep bringing everybody to the table to have a discussion ahead. And all I would just say is we collectively can keep working together as the fire service to be that master of communication and get our experts in sprinklers, get our expert home builders, get our expert building owners, get the folks from NFPA and ICC in the room to help you continue this conversation in that code environment at a state and local level, because we're seeing it from Chicago to New York, Philly, everywhere. And I think everybody's heart's in the right spot, but ultimately we've got a solution. We just got to figure out how we all can get it into these buildings.
And speaking of the solution and getting it into these buildings, which is a perfect segue. So thank you for that, Chief. I think the bottom line here is that whether they're required or not currently based on, you know, where your state or locality is at in adoption, we know these systems work and we know that adding them now can make a difference in saving lives. So how can we help building owners to retrofit their properties and ensure that they're protecting their buildings and tenants with fire sprinkler systems? And I actually would like to point out, for those who prefer to read instead of auditory, someone has dropped this in the chat, which is great. They are ahead of us. So, you know, legislatively, Vickie, can you talk a little bit about the Highrise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act and also the Public Housing Fire Safety Act? Because I think it's very important that people know what these pieces of legislation are and what they can do.
Absolutely. And thank you, Michaela. I think that our history shows us that time and time again, we are a reactionary society. It takes a tragedy for us many times to wake up. And when you take a look at tragic fires over the course of history, and you look at specific occupancies, you can see exactly that happening, that the tragedies occurred, and then policymakers, perhaps because they are awakened to the problem, respond with codes that require, with laws that do retrofit buildings. And I'll use as examples, when there were fires in jails, we then passed requirements for all jails to have fire sprinklers so that both the inmates and the correctional officers are protected in that environment. Hotels, the MGM Grand Fire in Las Vegas, you look back in time and you see, and then you see the legislation that typically follows a few years later. Again, we are reacting to those tragedies. I once had a building official say to me, and he had one of the thick code books that Chief OBrien and Karl and the crew are so familiar with. And he said, Vickie, do you realize that most every code that is within this code book comes as a result of something bad happening? And then the experts figuring out how we can address that. When there were nursing home fires, we passed legislation to retrofit our nursing homes. So I think that what you see happening in light of both the Bronx fire, the Philadelphia fire, it is our wake-up call. The time is now for us to provide incentives, to allocate funding for our HUD properties so that fire sprinklers can be included in that recipe to prevent that next occurrence. And the Highrise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act is prepared to do just that. It will provide a tax incentive to the building owner, because we all know that if you'll listen to the building owners, they will tell you it's just too expensive. But then if you go and you talk to someone who has had a fire, just as Lorraine was sharing, the Honolulu is such a great example of that. It is not going to cost you an ounce. I mean, like, it's no comparison when you compare it to having the fire and then the lawsuits that ensue. So the High-Rise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act will change the depreciation schedule from 27 years to 15 years for those building owners. And that's a big deal. We were able to see fire sprinkler incentives included for small business owners, and we rejoiced over that. The Station nightclub fire occurred in 2003. It took 15 years for legislation to pass, providing that incentive for the small business owners. It's time for us to do that for the high-rise buildings as well. And then on the Public Housing Fire Safety Act, I have to have a big shout out to the state of Minnesota. Tragedies occurred and Minnesotans responded with state legislation that is providing incentives for this so that it will not happen again. But Senator Smith jumped out, and Senator Klobuchar, with legislation that is still alive today, and that is the Public Housing Fire Safety Act. That is set to provide funding for HUD-based occupancies to retrofit with fire sprinklers. And that's a 10-year program, $25 million annually for that. So there are opportunities. And what you will see, and what I think for those of us at the National Fire Sprinkler Association, we rejoice when we see so many of our national fire service organizations coming together. The groups that are represented here on today's call, plus others, have been gathering. We do not sit idly by. And it is refreshing for us when the policymakers embrace the notion and say, what can we do to help? The answer is help us with incentives, help with funding where appropriate, and we will see America's fire problems significantly impacted. As Chief OBrien said, we have the solution. We know what can help, and it is indeed encouraging for us to be involved in the movement, if you will, of helping people understand and being part of the solution and saving lives in the process.
Thanks, Vickie. So I would say at this point, we are happy to open this up for questions. And while people are thinking of their questions and dropping them either in the Q&A or the chat, I just want to reiterate to Vickie's point, S265 and HR 2638 is the Public Housing Fire Safety Act, and thanks to Keith for throwing that in the chat. And HR 6192 and S3364 are the High-Rise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act. So to the extent that folks are here from Capitol Hill, certainly happy to answer any questions about that. If your boss is a sponsor or a co-sponsor, we truly appreciate it. This is a huge issue. And if you happen to notice that, you know, you'd like to be a part of it and do something on this issue, we'd certainly ask you to co-sponsor. And if you happen to be on this webinar from a non-Hill office or an outside group, are your members of Congress on there? If you've got questions about how to find your member of Congress, please feel free to reach out to CFSI or any of the organizations. If you've got questions about either of these bills, there's information on CFSI's website. Also happy to answer questions about that. I think Vickie made the point, and all of our panelists have backed this up so well, that I would say that the time is now, but the time has been now for a really long time. And I think it's great to have everyone here and being very supportive. And I think we have a really terrible and unfortunate moment where there's a little bit more attention in the public eye on this issue. And I think to those who are already educated on this, thank you so much for your work. And to those who are starting to learn about it, thank you so much for your interest. And I think there's still so much more that we can do together. So with that, let me just check the Q&A, but I'm not seeing any questions. And I will say, we've got a great panel here and we've got a lot of people who do this for a living. So if you have any questions, legislative or technical, your time is now. And while we're taking a last second, yeah, is there anyone on the panel who has a last item that they would like to share?
I just wanted to say a big thank you to you and your entire team at the Congressional Fire Services Institute. And I also thought it would be a great time to give a shout out to the dinner that's coming up and is scheduled to be in person. We're also excited to be back in Washington, D.C. And I know that that opportunity will give lots of us a chance to talk with policymakers and help bring this need to their attention. So I believe the dates are April 6th and 7th. Correct me if I'm wrong, Michaela. And you can register at cfsi.org. And it's just a great opportunity for all of us to be together, to join our forces. And a big thank you to Bill Webb, Michaela, Stephen, the entire team at CFSI. We really appreciate all you do for the nation's fire service 365 days a year.
Thank you, Vickie. And yes, I will echo that. Come join us. It's a great time. We've got educational seminars. We can talk a lot more about this issue and many others affecting the fire service. And it's, you know, to the following the DC COVID protocols. It's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more and make some great connections. So I'm not seeing any questions coming up in the chat or the Q&A, so we must have covered everything. So thank you to the panelists and thank you to everybody for attending today. If you do have questions that you'd like to bring up afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us here on this panel. To everyone attending, to everyone on the panel, thanks for all you do, and hopefully working together, we can get this over the finish line. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Happy Monday to everybody, and stay safe. Everybody.